December 18, 2021. The day when the second last TC2 update of that year would be released after the incredible streak of very good updates, that being the holiday update. It was lackluster compared to the others due to mostly being about slight rebalances and adding back old maps from the rotation, but it was still a pretty okay update. It was also the last one where Rolf gave a shit. One of the main reasons why this update was actually good is because it also added two completely new weapons after a full year of and those new weapons being the Blood Doctor and the Cold Shoulder. However, these two weapons would later become two of the most hated in the game for an entire year. Some people even calling them the absolute worst in the game, which is a very ballsy statement considering that back then we still had the worst thing ever made. And throughout the past year of using both weapons, I've started to see that the reasons for them being the worst weapons in the game are incredibly false and invalid. And that's why I want to show why these two weapons aren't actually that bad. Starting with the one I used the most out of the two, and the one I've used ever since it was released, the Cold Shoulder. So, why do people think the Cold Shoulder is bad? Why do people say that it's so bad that it could even be considered the worst one in the game? I mean, if a big guy in the community said it twice, then it must be true, right? To answer these questions, we need to ask ourselves a much more important one. Is the Cold Shoulder actually bad? To answer this question, I've made a list of the 3 most used reasons on why people think the Cold Shoulder is bad. We'll go through each one of them, so we'll be able to see if they're actually true. Let's begin with reason number 1. The Cold Shoulder is bad because compared to the other 2 projectile-based melees, it's the weakest of the 3. To understand this point, we need to look at the stats of all of the 3 projectile-based weapons. Let's begin with the one that is considered to be the best, the Rap Assassin. The Rap Assassin's projectile is a bubble that deals 40 damage and makes whoever gets hit by it bleed. The duration of the bleed ranges from how far you've thrown the bubble, going from 1 second to 7 seconds, which means it goes from 8 damage to 56 damage respectively due to the fact that it does 4 damage per tick. The Rap Assassin is mostly considered the best because the projectile helps out the most in a battle. Let's take as an example a fight with a brute, the easiest target for any flanker main. By hitting him with the bubble, you already deal 40 damage, and while you're hitting the brute with your very powerful meat shots, he's also bleeding every half of a second, giving you more of a chance of absolutely destroying him. And another factor that you can benefit from the bubble is that the bleed length, combined with the initial 40 damage of the projectile, can let you bleed out your opponent when you can't fight back, which is pretty funny, I'm not gonna lie. With that out of the way, let's look at the other well-known projectile-based weapon, the Sandman. The Sandman's projectile is a baseball that does the same amount of damage as the Rap Assassin's bubble, but instead of making your enemy bleed, it slows them down. Taking the brute fight as an example again, the slow effect doesn't really work out this time, apart from the fact that you did 40 damage to him. And also, slowing down a brute? Really? You might as well turn off his keyboard at that point, jeez. Now that we know both of these two, let's compare them to the Cold Shoulder, whose projectile is a snowball that does 1 damage, it recharges minus 25% slower, and has a blinding effect that lasts 3 seconds. In the brute fight scenario, the snowball actually helps with flanking your enemy since he's unable to see you, and for that, he's unable to predict where you're going. With this explanation, the reason why people say this is the weakest of the 3 projectile-based melees is pretty much invalid, since with it, people tend to think that since the snowball doesn't do much damage-wise compared to the other 2, then it's bad. When in reality, it doesn't really matter how much damage it can do, it's how useful its effect is, which don't worry, we'll get into it more later. And also, I just want to mention the most obvious thing in the world is that you're not throwing a baseball or a glass bubble. You're throwing a damn snowball you picked on the ground. Of course it's not going to do any significant damage. Otherwise, it would be weird if it did. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get into reason number 2. The Cold Shoulder is bad because the melee damage doesn't compensate for its weak projectile. This point, even though it was made back when the cold shoulder used to do the same amount of melee damage as the rap assassin, is still relevant as of right now. The cold shoulder in terms of melee damage is the exact same as the stock bat, which is 35 damage. And just like the stock bat, it crits players who are under 25% of their health. Oh yeah, there's also a 20% slower deploy speed, but the difference is so damn minuscule that I wouldn't blame you if you forgot it existed. This is pretty much a contrast to what the Sandman and Rap Assassin do for melee damage. Their projectiles do lots of damage, especially with the bubble, so to compensate, they make both of them extremely weak. The cold shoulder, however, since the snowball does 1 damage, they make it do the same damage as stock to make up for it. With this in mind, this reason is also invalid. Not because the melee damage of the cold shoulder is useful, it's situational than anything, but it isn't the main part of the weapon. It's like saying the disciplinary action is bad because it does very low damage. No shit, that's not the main part of the weapon. And also, I'm just saying, we've gone for 3 years of people memeing about the stock bat and that damn fish about how their stupid gimmick is actually kinda good. What makes the wooden stick the exception? Okay, now let's get into the last and most important reason. The cold shoulder is bad because its blinding effect is situational at best and useless at worst. The blinding effect the snowball gives, which is the main part of the weapon, is mostly considered bad because blinding effects don't really work in first-person shooters. Let's make a quick comparison by taking the one most people talk when discussing blinding effects, the blooper for Mario Kart. In that game, the blooper covers most of the screen with black ink, making it much harder for the player to see where they're going. Many people point this out to say that much like how this is not that difficult to deal with, the blinding effect of the cold shoulder is not that hard to deal with it as well. And there I say, this comparison is god-awful, and clearly a sign that people don't understand the main differences between the two. Let me explain. The blooper in Mario Kart is not that difficult to deal with, not because the blinding effect doesn't work, but rather it's because you have other things you can look at, such as the minimap, to know where you're going and nullify the blinding. And also, a track from Mario Kart can be memorized by a player the more they play it, so even then, they could just have muscle memory to make through blooper's effect. In a game like TC2, this is not the case, because you don't have to know the map to know what to do. You have to know where your opponents are at, which, with the fact that you have the main part of your screen blocked thanks to the snowball, is impossible.
Actually, you can just avoid the effect by pulling up the player leaderboard, so actually, the snowball is useless.
Well, let me tell you something, smartass. Not only are you relying on a visual bug, which will probably be fixed in a future update, if there is one, but I gotta give it up to you for that logic. Because you're saying that the solution to get something that covers your screen out is more stuff that covers your screen. I need to tell you, that's some very good thinking right there. Hey everyone, Editing Danced here. While this video was being made, the new 2-pack update came out and it did a lot of stuff and it changed a lot of things that made the game much more interesting and much more content filled. And I wanted to mention this because it's kind of funny that Rove secretly changed the cold shoulder's projectile damage to go from 1 to 10 damage, but couldn't be bothered to fix that visual bug that I literally just talked about. So I can keep this part in because Rove is lazy. Also, let's not forget the main target this weapon was made for. Marksman. Sure, you could make your point and say that the blinding effect doesn't really work for some classes like Doctor and Agent, but you can't say that this is an incredible tool to use against those pesky marksman mains that do nothing but absolutely destroy your team. One of them being me. I am not sorry for this. Because the fact that you can just constantly get that one marksman, making him unable to play the class, isn't only beneficial to you and your team, but also pretty funny for the marksman's reaction. So no, the blinding effect of the cold shoulder being bad is simply not true. Just because it feels very different and it takes more time to master compared to the Sandman and Rap Assassin, it isn't by no means situational nor useless. So, after all of this rambling, we can finally answer the main question. Is the cold shoulder that bad as many people say it is? No, absolutely not. Even if it went through several changes last year, and even if it's not the best melee weapon in Flanker's arsenal, it's still a close second. The cold shoulder is really good and criminally overhated, and it definitely deserves a second chance, because despite how low the damage its projectile can do, at least it's better than the atomizer.
parasitic the director.